Okay guys, welcome back to another video on how to make new game genres. I'll be your host, Dr. Octobeard, and today we're looking at hyper-casual games. I ran a series on established game genres in which I touched on casual games, those pick-up-and-play favourites like Candy Crush, Angry Birds, and maybe the first Plants vs. Zombies. We're coming. Hyper-casual games take this pick-up-and-play idea and refine it down to its simplest format. They're often called tap-to-play games because most hyper-casual games have incredibly simple controls that usually involve simply tapping or sliding one finger around the screen. This simple input allows the player to do one thing well, be that avoid obstacles, or not in my case.
Come on! Oh, come on now! Why do I suck so badly?
Grow your player as much as I suck at this game, and that's quite a large amount of sucking. Or move side to side picking up objects.
This is a beautiful, beautiful game.
These games are infinitely replayable because of their simplicity, and usually involve some kind of score that the player can return to again and again to beat.
Yes! Now I'm going to eat you! I'm going to eat most of you! Oh, tasty!
I played a lot of these games a couple of years back, and I actually reviewed some on my site. Links in the description. So here's how to make a very simple, hyper-casual interaction system.
Oh, wow, you can eat whole buildings. Oh man, I want to eat a building. I want to eat a building so much.
So one of the best ways to learn how to make a hyper-casual game is to play one and see what's happening. So here's one I've been working on. So the idea is the player controls this circle here. You move it underneath the towers and it eats the towers. It forces them to fall through the circle. It adds points to the score, and as you can see over here, the circle is slowly, very slowly, when I click back on, growing. As long as you keep feeding it, it will keep growing. It's all well and good eating the red towers, but if you try and eat one of the blue ones, it resets the game, kills it, and you're out. That's basically how this hyper-casual game works. So let's dig in a little and see what makes the game work. So first of all, I've got a player. I've created a player here. That player is simply a cylinder, a 3D game object, a cylinder with a few things added to it. Because it is the player, I've made sure to tag it. It starts off untagged. I've made sure to tag it player. This will be useful later on for interacting with the other objects, which are told only to interact when the player hits them. So the first thing I've got on here is a move hole script, so that when I move the mouse around, the cursor moves, the hole moves wherever I move the mouse. So there are a couple of important things to point out about this script. In fact, there's one really important thing, and it's this line here, 50F, 50 meters. This controls how far away the object that you put this script on, in this case the player, the black hole player here, how far away it is from the camera. So what I've done is I've set the camera to be 50 meters in the y-axis. That means it's 50 meters above here. And then in the script, I've told the player to be 50 meters underneath wherever the main camera is. That's what this 50F means here. The rest of this script just means that when I move the mouse in real time, the thing that it's attached to will move along with it. So the other things that have got scripts on them in this level are these little towers. If I just frame in on one here, you can see they are positioned just above the floor. They're not quite touching the floor. That's very important because ultimately I want them to fall through the floor. I don't want them standing on it. The floor itself is just a plane, but I've turned the mesh collider off. The idea being that when I move the hole underneath, they'll just fall straight through. If that mesh collider was still on, they would fall onto the plane and then topple over, and that's not what I want in this situation. So on the floor, the plane here, I've turned the mesh collider off and I've left everything else as it is. So onto the towers themselves, they have two things on them. They have a rigid body that's been attached through add component, rigid body that's been attached to them, and that rigid body has had the gravity turned on. I'm actually going to use a script to turn that gravity on and off. The gravity is going to start off, so they don't get pulled down straight away, and when the hole moves underneath them, the gravity will get turned on and they will pull down. So the other thing they've got on them is this script, the object to be eaten script. And that you can see here. So I've got two public variables in here. The first one is the rigid body that I've just attached here, and the second one is a Boolean is allowed to trigger. I've named this myself is allowed to trigger. Let me just explain what these two things do. In order for this object to be affected by gravity, it needs a rigid body, which I've put here. But in order for this rigid body to be controlled by that script, it needs to go in the little variable box here. So all I've done, because this object has the rigid body on it, you drag this object into the RB box. And each object that this is on will need to have that dragged in. So it usually makes sense to make one perfect and then duplicate it. Little tower 6 is a duplicated one right here, and you can see it's actually got little tower 6 automatically in there. So the trick is get one working perfectly and then duplicate it. So back into the script, I've got a rigid body and the script can control it here. I've then got this Boolean that tells me whether or not the object is allowed to trigger. I'll get to that in a second. At the start of the game, when the game wakes up at void awake, I'm getting the component of the rigid body. What this line does here is it tells the script to go and find that rigid body that we've put on the object. It also sets the gravity to false so the object doesn't fall straight through the plane at the start of the game. Finally, I've got this Boolean is allowed to trigger, which is set to true at the start of the game. And as I've written here, the reason we've got this is to stop all of the towers from falling when you hit the first one. Because we're going to be duplicating these towers, if we didn't have this bit of the script, as soon as you hit the first tower, all of the towers would fall, and that's not what we want. So outside of void awake, we've got void on trigger enter. And again, I've gone collider other, because down here I've got if the other game object tag is exactly equal to player, which is why it's so important to make sure that your player is tagged player up here at the top. So inside the onTriggerEnter function, I've got two if statements. First of all, if the object that we're inside the trigger of, if it's been enabled allowed to trigger, and if the thing that's inside is the player, then it will do all of this. So because each individual object has its own is allowed to trigger bool checkbox, it means that it will only drop that one object down instead of dropping them all down. So if the object is allowed to trigger, which it is at the start, and then if the player goes into this one specific object, it will turn the gravity on, RB, the rigid body, will change the gravity to true. This part here relates to the points script that I'm going to get into in a moment. It will add 50 to the current points. I'm using the current points variable here to control the scaling of the object, to make it grow in size and expand and get bigger and bigger. Underneath that, I've got to get component that turns that is allowed to trigger to false, so I can't trigger the same object again and again and again, and add 50, 100, 1,000 points to my score. And then finally, I'm adding another variable here to the points to scale script, total points, which is going to add 50 to my score. So current points here, current points controls the size of the hole. Total points controls whatever points appear on the screen, on the top corner of the screen. So if we skip back to the player for a second, you'll see there are two scripts on the player, move hole script and points scale hole script. So the points scale hole script controls the growth of the object as it collects more and more, as it eats more and more of these objects, it grows and grows and grows. And it also displays the score. Because it displays the score, it needs access to a canvas. Now, I've put the canvas on the main camera. I haven't made the main camera a child of the player here, because if I do that, watch what happens. Everything goes shooting off the side, and it's no good. I've kept that main camera separate and in a fixed position at the top of the screen. The main camera has a canvas and a text on it, and it's this text that I'm going to need to drag into the text variable here. So the first thing you'll notice is that I've got this unityengine.ui in here because I'm going to be working with on-screen text. The next thing I've got are the current points and total points variables that I was talking about a moment ago. In order for these two variables to be accessed by another script, so this line of script here means go to the points scale hole script, this script, and then find the current points variable and add to it. In order for the current points and total points variables to be accessible from a different script, they both need to be public and static. I've also got this Boolean in here, this bool grow, which controls whether the black hole is growing or not. The idea is that as long as I keep feeding it with points, it will grow, but if I stop feeding it, if it runs out of points to eat, it will stop growing. So I can switch its growth off. I've just put a Boolean in here that I can set to false. Finally, we've got that text variable here. That was what we dragged this canvas text into earlier on. At the start of the game, using Void Awake, I'm going to make sure the current points that controls the object growing and the total points that puts the points on the screen are both set to 0. So if the game restarts, they both go back to 0. I'm also going to tell the whole that it should not be growing. The Boolean grow is set to false. Moving into Void Update down here, I'm going to access that text variable called score text, and I'm going to throw the words score and a little space up on the screen, followed by whatever the total points are. You don't need this debug log. That's something that's been left over from testing. What I've now got is a series of if statements that essentially control what goes up in the scoreboard and if the player grows. So if the current points are greater than or equal to 0, if I've eaten something and I've got some points inside me, then the grow variable is turned to true. But what I also want it to do is I want those points to count down. I don't want it to be growing and growing and growing forever. If it's eaten 50 points, I want it to grow 50 points worth of size. That's what this line does. It says that the current points equals current points minus 10 times time.delta time. So what this will do is it will minus 10 from the current points over a period of time. So if I eat something and I get some points from it, those points will count down to a point where eventually they will hit 0. This is what this next bit of the script does. If the current points are ever less than or equal to 0, the first thing I'm going to do is set them to 0. I don't want them counting down to minus, otherwise the game won't work properly. If they're ever less than or equal to 0, it just sets them to 0. And then it switches the grow boolean off, which means if I run out of food, if I haven't eaten enough, then I won't grow anymore. Finally, if grow is equal to true, then what's going to happen is this game object, the game object that this script is on, is going to transform local scale. So local scale means it's going to grow in the scale dimension rather than moving or rotating. It's going to scale to a new vector 3, so this happens in real time. And these numbers here you might want to play with. So this is the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis. So because I'm looking at it from overhead, I want it to grow in the x, side to side. I want it to grow in the z, back and forth, but I don't want it to grow any closer to the camera, up and down. So that's 0. And you can see I've set these numbers very, very small. If I was to change the size of these numbers, save that script, then the whole will grow much faster. So now if I eat that, you can actually see how fast that whole is growing on the screen. And as long as I've got points in the bank, it will continue to scale and scale and scale until I've run out of points or until I hit a kill switch like that. So these numbers here are how you control how fast it scales. Having just seen that, I think I'm going to change mine to 0.05, 0.005, 0.005. The final thing to look at is this kill tower here. So the kill tower has a different coloured material on it, so I can see what it is, so I can tell it's different. And it has a different script on it. It still has a rigid body like all the others because I've just duplicated this and then I've taken the object to be eaten script off and I've added the points killer script on. So the first thing you'll notice is this Unity Engine scene management up here. This is going to allow me to reload the level if I accidentally hit one of these kill stations. It's got a rigid body on, same as the other. It's got a boolean is allowed to trigger, which again is going to make sure that if I've got multiple kill towers in there, if I hit one of them, the effect doesn't happen to all of them. And finally, I've added this string here, which is just text. It's text you can type into, which is the level name. The level name is whatever I've called this here, which in this case is black hole with a capital H there. So on the kill tower, I've gone in and I've typed the name of this level, which is black hole with a capital H there. So it knows to load this level. Because we're loading levels, I've just gone File, Build Settings, and I've made sure that black hole is in there. You can either add it as an open scene, or you can drag it in and drop it like that, just to make sure it's in the build settings. I'm not going to do that now, because it's already there. The other things it's doing in the script, very similar to the object to be eaten. It's getting the rigid body, it's switching the gravity off, and it's allowing that trigger to be true. And underneath this time, I'm simply saying that if the thing inside that trigger is tagged equal to player, double equal to player, then it will access the scene manager subroutines, it will load the scene, and it will load whatever the level name I've typed in here is, which is black hole here. So that's how to make a very simple hyper-casual style game. Other things that you could do if you wanted to add another level of complexity to your game, you could have the camera move up and up and up away from the player over time. So as they're area that they can move in grows, the camera moves further and further away, scales out. You could spawn in some of these other towers. You could even add in another one of these rings that's moving around on a preset path, trying to eat the player, and if the player makes contact with it, then it kills the game just as it did before. These are all things that you can do to make your hyper-casual game a little bit more challenging for the players to play. Thank you for watching this video on how to make new game genres.